Mr. Sanwal, we are here in Delhi at that time of the year when everyone talks about climate and climate change due to the pollution levels. But today also happens to be the day when the 27th session of Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, or COP27 as it is called, begins. 198 parties to UNFCCC gather once a year to discuss how to jointly address climate change. And this conference will be happening at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Mr. Sanwal, please tell us what would be India's focus areas at COP27.
The Indian delegation is led by the Minister of Environment, Mr. Bhupendra Yadav. And he has made the point that three focus areas are there for India in terms of the traditional agenda. That is finance, adaptation, and loss and damage. And there is a new emphasis that India is going to give following the Prime Minister's announcement and meeting with the UN Secretary General on life, that is, look at how else we can deal with the climate problem, because the Prime Minister has clearly appreciated that the path that had been taken earlier, which led to this problem, cannot be the same path that will lead to the solution. So maybe a different idea, different path is needed. But first I will emphasize on the 3 points of the traditional agenda that the Minister has highlighted. Now, finance has been a key issue for a long time, right from the beginning of the treaty, the signing of the treaty in 1992. In the Paris Agreement, when a global goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade was agreed, that we should not exceed this collectively, the developing countries were promised up to $100 billion a year from 2020 to 2025. We are already at the end of 2022, and that money is nowhere in sight. In fact, there is no commitment, there is no understanding of what constitutes that amount, and who is going to pay what to whom and in what manner. So, the Minister has rightly said that developing countries signed on to the Paris Agreement in the expectation that the additional burden that it imposed on them when they have not caused the problem needs to be provided for so that development is not hindered and the path for the developing countries to at least have comparable levels of income with the developed countries should not be hindered. The second issue is raising is adaptation. Now, there are two aspects to the problem, climate problem. One is that what we do in our daily lives, in our urbanization, and industrialization leads to emissions which accumulate in the atmosphere, and they actively create the problem of global warming, temperature rise, which has its implications in terms of increased frequency and severity of weather events like heat waves, hurricanes, excessive floods at locations which didn't face this phenomena earlier. So the entire climate system, in a sense, the seasons are changing. So he has said that, look, we can keep focusing on what we should do to reduce the flow of emissions into the atmosphere, but the impact of that is going to be felt down the line towards the end of the century, and in the meantime, developed countries are not meeting their share. So you cannot expect that developing countries will meet more than their fair share, and all these changes are taking place which are also expected to increase in severity. So we must start focusing on how we deal with this immediate problem so that it does not affect the lives of the poor, particularly in developing countries, till such time as the climate stabilizes and other countries who have contributed to the problem play a deeper role. This has not been accepted as a global goal so far. And the Minister says he is pushing for this on behalf of developing countries. And the third issue is this loss and damage is something like insurance. For example, if the coastal areas submerge, there are small islands which may go under the water. They're hardly a couple of meters above sea level in any case. So there needs to be some kind of insurance mechanism to deal with this problem. Otherwise, it will lead to massive migration. And migration itself means increased poverty. They don't have a place to go. They do not know what their future will be. So we need to start thinking about this problem, which is also looming on the horizon. Now, these are what we call the traditional agenda. There has been broad understanding on these three issues earlier. And since this is the implementation COP, he wants some action on these points. Now, in addition, India is going to stress LIFE, that is life for the environment, where India is that individuals contribute to the problem. If individuals themselves change their lifestyles without any regulation, without any need for the treaty, just because they understand that they are contributing to the problem, that itself will lead to a change. That has very serious implications, very serious positive implications. Because here there's a situation where there is a virtual standoff between developed and developing countries, and the Prime Minister Modi is proposing formally in this conference and has said so earlier to the nation, as to the world and to the Secretary General, that we need to change the way we look at this problem, and let us start thinking about that change. Let us start thinking on consumption patterns, because instead of looking at need, let us look at what is really justified by us in terms of consumption patterns, not that we as what we aspire to be. And that, I think, is not a new idea in terms of science, but is a new idea in terms of politics and the debate within the climate treaty. And if that gets some acceptance, it will take some time. It will not be accepted immediately into action. But at least he has begun a conversation to say, look, the method that we were following for the last 30 years not leaded to any tangible result. Let us look at something else also.
Mr. Sanwal, you're saying the three traditional areas, focus areas of finance, adaptation and loss and damage, and what Prime Minister Modi mentioned in his national statement last year, lifestyle for environment, or life, as an important step towards meeting the target of net zero or reducing carbon emissions by 2070, which he mentioned last year. Let's come to the first point, which is very critical, that is finance. And I think it was over a decade ago in Copenhagen, I think COP15 it was, where the developed countries had committed to jointly mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 till 2025. And as you mentioned in your answer before that, nothing seems to have happened there, although some numbers are bandied around from time to time. And I was looking at during the pandemic, most of the rich countries, USA included, they had purchased assets worth, basically printing money, assets worth $32 trillion. So why is $100 billion a year such a difficult thing especially when the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that climate change situation was nothing less than a code red for humanity, and the alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. So why is the world not putting its money where its mouth is?
I think it goes back to the time when the climate treaty was being negotiated, and the question was, who has to do what? And at that time, developing countries, that is India, China, Brazil, the big major countries, and all the others, were really not that very rich. China's growth starts shooting up around 2000. There was a legitimate claim that, look, all of us are agreed to join on a global cause, but you need to balance. Since we have not caused the problem, you need to, if we take action, you will need to provide finance and technology. Now, the first thing that fell by the wayside was transfer of technology. They never agreed to it very explicitly, and there is hardly any discussion about it now. Even for finance, in the climate treaty in 1992, they made a formal commitment to provide for national communications, for what you have to do to study the problem. But they did not provide a formal commitment on what you need to do to solve the problem. It could be the problem of growing emissions and changing your industrialization pattern, urbanization pattern, or, as we have said earlier, adaptation, that will be adverse effects of climate change. Now, this went on from 1992, as I said, to the Paris Agreement. And in the Paris Agreement, it was a high-level agreement. A lot of pre-diplomatic activity, heads of state were there. And the decision was taken that there would be a collective goal. All the countries in development, irrespective of their level of development or their level of contribution or the problems that they were facing, agreed to a common goal to keep emissions from going above 1.5 degrees centigrade by around 2050. Which means everybody needs to start reducing. And to get that agreement, the developed countries promised $100 billion finance a year between 2020 and 25. Now, so they made the promise of a quantity of money, but it was time limited. Problems that developing countries are facing, the 2 years are already over. As you said, the pandemic and other global situation is such that they are not showing any keenness in providing that money. Now, India, for example, has made its commitment to achieve net zero by 2070, conditional on the provision of finance. This is the situation with other countries too. Their national commitments or what they are committing to do to the global community is conditional on this money. So that is why I think India very rightly is placing this high on the agenda, saying that, look, we agreed to make a collective effort, even though we have not contributed to the problem and even though we are not ready to do all that. So our per capita energy use, our emissions, our level of development, urbanization, whatever parameter you choose, is way below your level. But yet, because it's a global problem, we agree to take part as equals, but you need to provide so that our development effort is not hindered. Now, the problem that they are seeing is that they don't want to admit or commit that this is a problem which they have created and therefore they should transfer some. And unless you have that kind of formal commitment, the national budget do not provide for it. Since the national budget does not specifically provide for this kind of amount, because there is no formal commitment, it is very difficult to also see how you calculate this amount. There are views that the developed countries are saying that even what the private sector invests should be included, whatever we do for other humanitarian or other grounds. So whatever money flowing from developed to developing countries should be included in this in essence. It's not a grant, it's a loan. Now, developing countries are rightly saying that if we had to take a loan from the private sector, from the market, we don't have to come to Sharm el-Sheikh to get that loan. We negotiate outside this process. In this process, we have taken certain commitments because of the global cause, as have you. So we need to deal with it separately to what is happening in the market. So basically, the discussion is going to veer around how you define it and to what extent the normal flows, irrespective of the climate issue or for whatever reasons, should also be included so that the amount is reduced. But even then, even that reduced amount, the grant component, which really means transfer of money in the real sense of aid, loan from private sector banks to another private sector bank in a developing country is really not aid. It's going to be contentious, but even that reduced amount is going to be difficult to achieve because they have shown no interest in this. Their interest has waned after the global commitment by all countries that yes, we agree to take an equal share of the problem. Equal share in the sense we agree to do something about it, irrespective of our level of development. So it's going to be an interesting discussion, and let us see how it unfolds.
Right, as you mentioned, Mr. Sanwal, that the next few days promise to be interesting, to use the phrase that you use, and hopefully we will come out with more clarity, especially in climate finance, and also the thing that the Prime Minister mentioned last year, life, which you also talked about. Mr. Mukul Sanwal, thank you so much for joining us on All India Radio.